Hello, it's Brooke again, coming fresh off of finishing the Crip camp documentary, and we're going to be discussing the 4 points in this assignment. Starting off with point number 1, which are some of the key points of the disability rights movement covered within this documentary. So first, we kind of start off after they leave the Crip camp section of the documentary where they're following the kids during their time at camp. We enter into kind of the real everyday world where we learn that the Rehabilitation Act of 1972, which had an anti-discrimination provision for anyone getting federal funds from the government, had to make accommodations for those with disabilities. However, this act was vetoed by the current president at the time, sparking the individuals who had created and started up the Disability in Action group to start protesting in the streets and blocking traffic to the best of their abilities to get their voices heard. And then following in 1973, another demonstration in DC was happening during the Vietnam War, incorporating veterans that had been disabled in action to kind of let America know that this is everybody's issue, not just people that they don't necessarily think about all the time. Following this, Nixon eventually does sign the rehab bill, but Section 504 was almost entirely ignored. And following this, the Center for Independent Living was created in Berkeley to kind of help individuals who are disabled live as close to a normal life as they wish to have with the assistance from these individuals. And in 1977, there still wasn't much enforcement of the anti-discrimination laws within this act. So those individuals that were part of the Disability in Action group started holding overnight protests in front of legislators' office that continued to try and get these bills to be signed and put in force. And this is known as the 504 sit-in, which took place for, I believe, about 23 days, including sleeping on the floors of the legislative buildings and some people even going through hunger strikes during this time. And finally, Congressman Califano, if that's how you pronounce his name, finally signed those reforms ending the sit-ins. Moving on to point number 2 on how these laws have impacted school. Kind of the biggest thing that I went whoa during this documentary was when they were talking about creating separate but equal schools for disabled individuals, which during this time obviously civil rights was going on as well. This was a huge issue, so it's kind of just so alarming that it was happening to so many different marginalized groups of individuals, and frankly it was kind of disgusting to listen to, and I felt the same way that those individuals felt when they were fighting for their rights, the same pain in my heart for them that they probably felt for themselves. Followed by, once these laws were finally starting to get put into place, federally funded schools did have to make their school grounds and bathrooms and classrooms accessible for these disabled individuals. Moving on to point 3, which laws were put in place successfully versus unsuccessfully implemented. So after these laws were signed and put into place and more heavily enforced, ramps and elevators were required in all federally funded buildings to create more accessibility for disabled individuals, as well as interpreters and other aids became more readily available through federal funding and grants for individuals that were in need of them. However, there was still fight for enforcement of 504 laws in a lot of areas, and places that weren't under federal funding didn't have to comply with these rules, such as businesses and other private institutions that weren't required to stop their discrimination in the hiring process or make their buildings and facilities accessible to these individuals. How this documentary is going to affect my teaching is, I remember from one of the very first clips of this documentary, an individual at the Crip camp, or Camp Jeanette, I believe is what it was called. He talked about how he didn't have much interaction with disabled individuals, got on this bus of a group of however many of them were on the bus, and he had some fear about going into that situation. Meanwhile, somebody comes up behind him and pushes him along because they're in his way, and he just kind of took that momentum to get him through the rest of the summer. I want to take that no fear and jumping 2 feet in with helping out my students if I were to have individuals such as those in my classroom in the future. So just no fear, know that they're just wanting to have a regular experience just like every student, and I don't have to be worried about, how my actions would affect them as long as I'm coming from a place of care and understanding. And finally, another thing that really hit me towards the end of the documentary was the ma'am Judy, who was ahead of a lot of these movements, talking about how when bathrooms finally became accessible, she felt odd about being happy to have the privilege of an accessible bathroom, and how being happy about that privilege inherently doesn't make her feel equal. So as a teacher, I really hope that I just from the get-go am going to make the most accessible and inclusive classroom for my students as possible, so there's not any doubt that their privilege is, a privilege. Like, it's their right. It's not a privilege, actually. Sorry, phrase that a little incorrectly. That they have a right to have an accessible classroom, and it's not a privilege, and that they are equal just like everyone else in the class. Overall, I thought this was an incredibly insightful documentary, and I really hope that it reaches other individuals that might not know much about this topic and can give them some empathy and respect for what these individuals had to fight through to get to where we are in our lawmaking and school system today.